Well, good morning, folks. John Adams, the Rehab and Documentation Guru. This time filming from my basement, little office area that I have. It's about the only place I can find in the house that has a little corner I can sequester myself. So it's about -1 degrees down here, but it is what it is, and it works for me. So last video, I covered the word safety. So how does safety impact how we get paid for what we do? And so today I wanted to go through another word that's prominent in the definition of medical necessity, and that is effective. And so you've probably heard the terms safety and effectiveness put together when you're talking about things that are, let's say, new on the market in the healthcare world, that they had to prove the safety and effectiveness of this particular treatment. In the world of rehabilitation, where we have long established interventions, I mean, there are some newer ones like dry needling in the last so many years, but there's long established interventions that have been utilized for a while that have already been proven safe and effective. The question is it only effective if you are going to do it? And so how do you as a skilled licensed clinician who is billing for something prove that you are the avenue to effective treatment, if that makes sense? And so one of the lines of defense that we have is going to be, first of all, the relationship between our ICD 10 codes and our CPT codes. So, what is the diagnosis and how does it relate to the intervention? So, if I have a diagnosis that, let's say, Medicare has a history of billing for therapy services related to that diagnosis, and they see that on average, a number of people or a high percentage of therapists are billing one particular intervention. Let's just throw Therax out there. It might be safe to assume that the vast majority of therapists realize that Therax is a safe and effective intervention for that particular diagnosis. So they have the data to back that up. But they might see a particular therapist who bills a totally off the wall CPT code. That might trigger a response from a third party payer like Medicare and say, you know what? Probably not an effective intervention, probably not supported by the vast sum of all these smart therapists. And then they could look in their policy manual and see, okay, this intervention usually doesn't go with this particular diagnosis, so it doesn't make sense. So they would view your treatment potentially as ineffective, which is exactly obviously the opposite of what we want. But what's another way that we can determine whether something is going to be effective? Well, it's simply the ongoing measurements. So when you do an intervention, and I'm going to pick on the CPT code 92507 for a minute, which is used by speech language pathologists to treat, and so listen to this definition: speech, language, voice, communication, and auditory processing disorders. Now, speech therapists are generally going to be able to find something within that category to use the 92507 that they're actually measuring. So at the eval, hopefully they've looked at basically all of these with either a comprehensive screening tool or they've targeted specifically what is the accurate measurement of the problem. So, voice, what is the problem with the voice? Vocal, I've heard the term frying. Speech therapists tell me if that's a good word. Also, maybe the volume of the voice, and they can measure that. The patient has insufficient decibels of production of sound that makes it they're below a threshold where they can carry on adequate conversation with people, and so that's something they need to work on. So a speech therapist will measure that at eval, and then the ongoing measurement of that particular concern, let's say voice, as treatment progresses, is the justification for continuing to bill 92507. proving clinical effectiveness. One thing I tell therapists regularly is if you don't measure it, you cannot treat it. And if you don't ongoingly measure it, you cannot continue to justify your ongoing treatment. Let's look at another one. Therapeutic exercise. So since this is a very common one, both PT and OT utilize it. It's what does therapeutic exercise address? Strength, endurance, range of motion, and flexibility. Unless you have a measurement in those things, there's no justification whatsoever to bill for therapeutic exercise. I use this example. So I used to audit, almost exclusively, this was my job, audit therapy notes for a fairly large rehab company. And I remember one case in particular we had a denial on. It was 2 months of occupational therapy. And at question from the payor was 2 months of therapeutic exercise. And what was happening was this was a daily patient, 5 days a week. This is a Med A inpatient SNF patient. Every single day, this OT was delivering about a half hour at least of therapeutic exercise. That's a lot of exercise, first of all, especially for somebody that's at the subacute level of recovery. And this was an elderly person. And so the only measurement related to what I just read off, strength, endurance, range of motion, and flexibility, that would fit the category of TheraX was strength. So the therapist had an initial reading, and they did take follow-up readings as these 2 months progressed. But the problem was there was absolutely no change in strength. The measurements remained the same during the 2 months. They delivered a boatload of, and this is when therapy minutes were more important under PPS, they had delivered a boatload of therapy minutes to no avail. And so effectiveness of that particular treatment was nil. So when you're looking to prove medical necessity, one of the words we keep in mind is effectiveness. So two basic avenues to making sure you're promoting that you're fulfilling that is one, does the ICD-10 code lead to the CPT code need? And then two, initial and ongoing measurements that show clinical effectiveness over time. That's all I've got for today. John Adamson, the Rehab and Documentation Guru. Thanks for joining me, and I'll talk to you soon.